In this episode, we look at the life of Hannah Brackenbury. For many listening, this name may be familiar. If you have children or grandchildren in Portslade, there is a chance they go or have gone to Brackenbury School. Or those of you who attend or have visited St Nicholas Church, you may have seen the Brackenbury chapel situated within. But who was this Victorian lady who has a name attached to such prominent buildings? Wealthy? Yes, with assets worth over £30 million in today's terms. But how did a lady in Victorian times gain so much wealth when the laws of the land would not generally allow this? And why did she build a school in Portslade? Was it through her generous nature, or was there something more devious going on? We go back 150 years to start our investigation. The date is May 25th, 1872. Most of the 4,000 population of Portslade are gathered in the old village. The church bells of nearby St Nicholas are pealing out a new beginning for the children of Portslade, whilst the Stag's Head pub is doing a roaring trade for a Saturday afternoon. At 3:45 p.m, a marching band strikes up and leads the jubilant crowds through Portslade High Street to Locks Hill. Before them stands a brand new purpose-built school. Dignitaries and members of the church are awaiting the arrival of the hordes of Portsladers to officially open the town's first ever purpose-built school. Standing quietly and almost alone in this group of prominent Victorian men is a 77-year-old lady. She is unmarried, has no children, and is nearing the end of her life. But without her, this day would not be happening. Her name is Hannah Brackenbury. She has paid for the land and the building costs of this new school. But who was this wealthy benefactor of Portslade? To start to understand this, we need to go back to the Georgian era in Lancashire. Author Julie Ryan explains.
Hannah Brackenbury was born in Leyland, Lancashire in 1795. She was the eldest of 4 siblings, but just 2 of her brothers, James and Ralph, survived infancy. She seems to have spent the first half of her life in Manchester, though little is known about her early years. However, we do know that her 2 brothers were highly successful people. Ralph became a doctor, and James was a solicitor with his own practice. It was James who made the family fortune, thanks to a number of shrewd investments in the Lancashire and Yorkshire railways. During the British Railway Mania, which took place between 1843 and the autumn of 1845, the prices of railway shares doubled and thousands of new railway lines were projected. However, in 1846, share prices fell dramatically, investors lost fortunes, and the railway industry endured a sustained downturn. Luckily for Portslade, the Brackenbury fortune survived, mainly due to James Brackenbury becoming ill and his investments being cashed in before the stock market crash. But unfortunately, James Brackenbury was now in very poor health, and in 1844, Hannah Brackenbury moved to Hove with her ailing brother to care for him. The Sussex coast and its healing waters had been made famous by the Prince Regent, and it was common for people to move south in the hope of healing their sickness. Sadly, the sea-water did not bring James Brackenbury a cure, and he died that same year, aged just 48. His wife had predeceased him, and their 11-year-old daughter, Harriet, inherited her father's fortune. It seems likely that Hannah adopted Harriet and continued living at 13 Brunswick Terrace in Hove. And there our story would have ended, if not for another tragic turn of events. In 1886, Harriet died, aged just 28, and her only surviving relatives, her Aunt Hannah and Uncle Ralph, inherited the family fortune. But it was not without its problems. A court case, the Attorney General versus Brackenbury, took place in January 1863. The Crown insisted that a 5% inheritance tax was due, as James Brackenbury's original will had now passed on twice. A lengthy court case ensued, which was eventually won by the Crown, and the Brackenburys had to pay the 5% inheritance tax. Within 18 months of the court case, Ralph Brackenbury died at the age of 67. Ralph was unmarried with no children, and thus his share of the family fortune now passed to his sister, Hannah Brackenbury, and she was now one of the richest people in Sussex. Her estimated wealth in today's terms is thought to be around £30 million.
So, what was life like for a single Victorian lady with lots of money? And how did they spend their days? We spoke to Paula Wrightson of Brighton Hove Museums.
So yes, very wealthy woman indeed. She's giving away £1,000 during her lifetime. So that's multi-millions of pounds today. She doesn't get married, as we know, so she has no children to look after, no husband. And wealthy women obviously not doing their own housework and childcare, but running a family home for a Victorian woman was much like today being somebody who's running perhaps a small hotel, directing how the house runs. So you're spending a lot of your time talking to your housekeepers, butlers, cooks, and directing what goes on. However, you are still going to have a lot of time on your hands without paid employment, and Hannah is what they call a gentlewoman, and I've got a copy here of the 1861 census, and that is her occupation, word that's really gone out of usage now. If she was a creative sort of woman, which many women were, because having creative skills was considered ladylike, so you might take up crafts that we'd recognise today, like embroidery, making quilts, that sort of thing. Or you might go into some of the odd sort of crafts that have now disappeared, such as making pictures out of shells or wax flowers, all these sort of items that you probably saw in antique emporiums many years ago, feathers turned into paintings, that sort of thing. Crocheting hair, found that one fascinating, making pictures out of felt, all these things to fill your day. So occupations that are time consuming, that's the important thing for a lady in the Victorian period, with a lot of time on their hands and plenty of money.
The Brackenbury wealth came from the advent of the railways. Was this a usual form of wealth in Victorian society, and did it take over from the slave trade as a means of making money?
Hannah was a philanthropist, so her thinking is essentially humanitarian. And so she's born into the period of the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. Now, we don't know whether she was directly involved with that, but as a philanthropist, I think we can say that is where her heart would lie. For someone like Hannah, she would be a Christian, and slavery was seen as unchristian. And for the more secular person, it was considered a violation of human rights. Way back, we talk about rights now, way back people were talking about that in Hannah's childhood and before Hannah was even born. So wealth, we know she wasn't connected with the slave trade in any way. As far as we know, that's not where her family money came from. Money in Britain and wealth came from, we've got three really big major forms: land and agriculture, manufacturing and industry, the Industrial Revolution, which Britain was at the heart of. So that's where your wealth was coming from. But the railways, oh my goodness, that what an exciting subject, and what an excitement for people of Hannah's generation. She's a middle-aged lady when the railways steam into Britain, changing life forever. There was a huge boom in the 1840s of railway companies, and these are all private companies. Victorian Britain is a capitalist society par excellence, and if you wanted to make money, railways were a great way of doing it. As with the tech companies in the 90s, back in the 1840s and again in the 1860s, these two big periods of railway boom time, you could invest. If you had money, you would buy shares in the company, and hopefully your shares would bring you regular dividends of cash every month coming in. And again, very similar in our own lifetimes. Say you invested in Microsoft way back when it first started and you had a whole load of Microsoft shares, well, you'd be a multi-millionaire now, wouldn't you? So that was what was going on in the Victorian period. You hoped to invest in a railway company that was going to do extremely well, so the popular lines, the popular routes. So I'm not at all surprised to find Hannah investing some of her money in railway shares.
Hannah Brackenbury was very generous both in her lifetime and in her final will. Was this usual for the Victorians to be generous when they were alive, as Hannah was, and also leave so much to charity when she died?
I'm not at all surprised again by this. The Victorian wealthy people were incredibly generous. I'm almost tempted to say more generous than people are today. There were two main routes of your philanthropy. they were religion and social class. We're going back to the Victorian period, a real big revival of Christianity and very strong belief. So most people, and certainly all people of money, are trying to live the values of Christianity and the Bible. And Hannah would have read the Bible and she would know these phrases by heart. And she would have tried to live by them. She would have wanted to live by them. So, for example, she would know the line from the writings of Matthew, quote from the Bible. Jesus says, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." This is the root of Victorian generosity, and people live by it. And of course, we're looking at an age where there is no real structure for social benefits, no help from the state in Victorian period, and you're relying on people who are advantaged to help the disadvantaged. So that's that's your basis for helping others. The other is social class, and the upper class and the very wealthy of the Victorian period saw it as their duty to look after those who were less privileged. It was a good thing for a gentleman or a gentlewoman to help others. Now, this could be seen as good-hearted, very Christian, but it could also be viewed as sort of self-preserving, if you like, for the rich. If you're running a factory or a cotton mill or some other industry, or you own some coal mines, you own some railways, you want your workers to be healthy, not be dying all the time. So it's in your best interest, a capitalist owner of wealth, to have a workforce who aren't dying of dysentery because the water is unclean, and it makes profitable sense to keep your workers fit and alive and able to breed more workers to bring you more money. But there were smaller charities, and I think Hannah would have also been either involved with these in a small local way, or knew friends who were. And so on a homely scale, Victorian women, maybe even lower down on the social ladder, women of the middle class, would be helping raise money for charity through local fairs, church bazaars, raising funds for the poor by making some of those items I mentioned earlier, little things that you could sell at a local bazaar. Women like Hannah would have done this through what they called parish work. So visiting the poor with offers of practical help, food, clothing, particularly for helping people whose wages were very low or non-existent or seasonal. Here on the south coast, people working in fishing industries or people working in agriculture in the winter months. And again, you can go online, if you just type in charities created in the Victorian period, you will come across hundreds, some of them very famous today, charities around helping children, orphans, and also animal charities. The Victorians were extremely interested and forward-thinking on animal welfare. Each church would have the poor box at the back, so you were encouraged to give to the poor through putting some money into the poor box. And all this parish work was much promoted by women's magazines.
With her new wealth and no living relatives to pass it on to, Hannah gets busy helping causes close to her heart. She obviously feels a strong sense of family and supports causes she knows her deceased brothers would have approved of. Money is given freely to health charities, hospitals, Manchester University, and scholarships for students to study law. However, one of her largest donations was to Balliol College at the University of Oxford. No members of the Brackenbury family had attended Oxford or indeed ever lived there. Dr. Bethany Hambling, Archives and Records Manager at Balliol College, explains why Hannah was so generous to the University of Oxford.
Hannah Brackenbury believed that her ancestors had been closely associated with the Balliol family, whose members, John de Balliol and his wife, Lady de Vorgilla of Galloway, founded Balliol College in the 13th century. The family connection is uncertain, but it led Hannah to choose the college as a beneficiary of her considerable philanthropy. She was first put in touch with Robert Scott, the master of Balliol College, in 1865. Over the next several years, she endowed 8 Brackenbury scholarships in history and natural science, as these seemed closest to the interests of her brothers, who were legal and medical professionals. These scholarships continue today, and some famous Brackenbury scholars include Nobel Prize winner in chemistry Sir Cyril Hinshelwood and Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Now, by the 19th century, the whole medieval front range of Balliol College was in very bad condition, with one student complaining that it would peel and flake in a strong wind, and the master was looking for ways to fund its much-needed rebuilding. Hannah's belief in her ancestral connection with the Balliols may have been reinforced by the existence of the Brackenbury Tower at Barnard Castle, the main base of the Balliol family in England. Master Scott joked that Hannah might like to build a Brackenbury Tower at Balliol, and that's basically what she did, especially when told that her Brackenbury scholars would also live in the residential accommodation funded by her gift of £15,000, around £1 million today. So the appearance of Balliol today, the frontage that greets thousands of students and tourists to Oxford, is very much thanks to Hannah Brackenbury, and of course the architect, Alfred Waterhouse, whose designs were approved in 1867. In fact, these south and east ranges comprising accommodation, a porter's lodge, and a lecture room, now the bursary, are known as the Brackenbury Buildings, and feature her coat of arms over the college's main gate. The heraldry incorporates symbols, including 3 upright swords, said to represent the connection between the Brackenbury and Balliol families. Her motto, incorporated into her crest, translates as, "Never ever give up." We like to think that today's students find these words just as inspirational as the original beneficiaries of Hannah's generosity.
But Hannah's generosity extended closer to home, right here in Portslade. Author Julie Ryan picks up the story.
Hannah Brackenbury purchased and then donated the land where the eponymous school stands in Locks Hill, Portslade. The school was originally called the Brackenbury School when it opened in 1872. The school minute book from 151 years ago reveals the following details.
On the 23rd of March 1871, the ecclesiastical commissioners in whom were vested the Canterbury Archbishopric estates conveyed an acre of land to the vicar and churchwardens of Portslade for a school site in consideration of £100 paid by Miss Hannah Brackenbury. The schools are specifically for the children of the labouring, manufacturing and other poorer classes of the parish of Portslade.
In 1881, separate departments were created for the infants and mixed classes, while in September 1883 a separate girls' department was formed and an additional classroom was erected. The small school on an acre of land has certainly grown. Hannah Brackenbury never lived in Portslade. She kept a staff of 5 at her homes in Hove, moving between properties in Brunswick Terrace and Adelaide Crescent. Her favourite staff member was Alice King, who was originally from Yorkshire. It seems Alice was a constant companion to Hannah, and she also benefited generously from Hannah's will when she died in 1873. It included £1,500 in trust for each of Alice's 2 nieces, and £10,000 in trust for my faithful and affectionate friend Alice King, spinster, now residing with me. At this time, a typical wage for a professional worker was just £300 per year. Hannah died on the 28th of February 1873 after a short illness. At this time she was living at Adelaide Crescent in Hove. Her funeral and the cortege took an hour to travel from Adelaide Crescent to St Nicholas's Church. Her hearse was drawn by 4 black horses and followed by 5 other coaches, all drawn by horses. The children of Brackenbury School attended as a mark of respect, and the large congregation included the Reverend Professor Jowett, Master of Balliol College at Oxford University. As the church bells had pealed out just 8 months previously to celebrate the new school opening, they now rung once again, this time signalling the end of the line of the Brackenbury family. The polished oak coffin with its silver furniture and nails was placed in the Brackenbury family vault that had been completed 4 years previously, and thus Hannah was reunited with her beloved brothers James and Ralph and her niece Harriet.
By 1884, just 11 years after Hannah's death, she seems to lose naming rights of the Portslade School. From this point, the Brackenbury School is renamed St Nicholas and then becomes Portslade County Infants after the Second World War. But following a review of names in 2013, it changes again. The school is once again called Brackenbury. So where does one begin to sum up the life of Hannah Brackenbury? Perhaps we should start with a controversial point. Was Hannah Brackenbury scheming and calculating? As we heard during this podcast, Hannah never lived in Portslade or owned property here. Indeed, her local church was St Andrew's Chapel in Waterloo Street, Hove, so there's no obvious direct connection with St Nicholas Church. So why build a school here and also choose it as her family's final resting place? She clearly understood that money brought power and influence. Her local church in Hove had no room for a private chapel, being surrounded by residential buildings. However, St Nicholas in Portslade had plenty of land to build a lasting monument to the Brackenbury family. But why would the Portslade vicar let a woman from Lancashire, who lived in Hove and worshipped at another church, build her own mausoleum at a medieval church in Portslade? To answer this, we need to go back to that day in May 1872 and the opening of the new school. Hannah Brackenbury had purchased the land for the building of the school for £100 and took on all subsequent building costs. Generous, I hear you shout at your device, but let us break this down. Between 1865 and 1872, Hannah donated just over £100,000 to more prestigious and high-profile institutions. Of course, she did not have to donate anything to Portslade, but £100 was a drop in the ocean. She also had a personal allowance from her investments in the railways of £7,000 per year, so £100 represented just over 1% of her annual disposable income. But she funded the building of the school, I hear you respond. Well, yes she did, but the work was contracted to John King, the brother of Alice, who was Hannah's most trusted companion. And the plot of land included a site for a house to be built for Alice. This would become Sellerby House, which is still there to this day. Is it fair to say that the building of Portslade School was the leverage that Hannah required to get permission for her own chapel? It certainly feels like that, and perhaps we should acknowledge the negotiating skills of the Reverend Holbrook, who was vicar at this time. There was even a clause in Hannah's draft will a year before she died that funds from her estate should be used to complete the building of the Portslade School. And to sweeten the deal further, she even left the Reverend Holbrook £300 in her will. That is about 2 years' wages for a man of the cloth at this time. Perhaps the words scheming and calculating may sound harsh to some. However, I'm sure we can agree Miss Brackenbury was shrewd and knew how things worked in the Victorian world. Today she would be considered a fine businesswoman who understands branding, negotiation and influence. Incredible attributes for a woman in a male-dominated world of Victorian society. Other historians have focused on her personal relationship with Alice King, writing with an outdated view as Alice being her special friend. Whatever Hannah's sexuality, I believe these historians are missing a bigger point about her, and this point is forward planning and protecting her family's lasting legacy. Until 1870, any money that a woman earned became the property of her husband, and it was not until 1882 that married women would have complete personal control over all of their property. From Hannah's point of view, getting married would put her family's legacy in extreme jeopardy. Her sense of history and obligation to her family name would have been a driving factor to ensure that she had complete control of all of her assets. The Brackenbury name needed to stride purposefully through the future ages, and who could blame her for wanting that? But ultimately she was generous. Although she only supported 8 charities in Brighton and Hove, totalling £3,500 in donations, she supported a further 32 charities back in her native North, plus in Oxford and in Surrey. An unfair balance, some may think, but you would not criticise somebody supporting Oxfam over a Brighton-based charity. And Hannah was very generous to her friends. In her will, which she revised just a week before her death, she left 40 people sums averaging £300 each. The average wage in 1880 was £100 a year. Where the money was left to women, it carried the proviso, and when in favour of married women, it is for their separate use and not paying the debts of their husband. So finally, it may be that the only reason Portslade has the Brackenbury School is the fact that our local church had a bit of spare land to build a chapel upon. But this does not take away the generous legacy that Hannah Brackenbury leaves behind. It is very easy to point to her legacy at Oxford University and funding the education of a future Prime Minister as her major achievement, but this would be a narrow view. Her support of a local school in Portslade was pivotal to the development of the town. A purpose-built school for the working classes of Victorian Portslade would encourage manufacturers to build their businesses here and thus creating more jobs and better living conditions. And Wise Portslade County Infants, or the Brackenbury School it's now once again called, has not produced any Prime Ministers. It has produced children with a good round standard of education. Whether they be builders or bankers, doctors or dockers, pilots or even podcasters, we're all grateful for the vision, determination and forward thinking of Hannah Brackenbury. Thank you for listening, and thank you to our contributors Julie Ryan, Paula Wrightson, Andrew Ryan MBE and Dr. Bethany Hamblin. We will be back in October with another edition of Romans, Normans and Poundland, A Brief History of Portslade. Find us wherever you get your podcasts from or at portsladehistory.co.uk. This has been a Fresh Start Portslade production.